Caleb Rourke rode onto Elias Crowe's land like he owned it already. He didn't knock, didn't call out, just came through the gap in the fence where the post had rotted through last winter, his horse stepping over the fallen rail without breaking stride, and Caleb himself sitting up in the saddle like a man inspecting property that already had his name on the deed. Elias was splitting wood near the barn when he heard the hooves. He set the axe down slowly. Caleb pulled up 10 feet away and looked around the yard with the kind of expression a man uses when he's trying not to laugh. Crow. He said it the way you'd say the name of a disease. Heard you've been spending time over at the Hayes place. Elias said nothing, widow like that. Caleb clicked his tongue. All that land. All those water rights. A poor man could solve a lot of problems real fast if he played his cards right. The words hit the yard like something thrown. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel and follow every part of this story to the very end, because what happens next will shake this entire valley to its roots. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning Caleb Rourke rode onto Elias Crowe's property uninvited was not the first time the man had made his contempt plain. But it was the first time he'd said it out loud, in the open, where the words couldn't be taken back. Elias picked up the axe again, not in a threatening way, just picked it up and held it, the way a man holds something familiar when he needs to keep his hands from doing something else. You finished? Elias asked. Caleb smiled. It wasn't a good smile. Just offering some friendly observation. Man in your position, I'd be careful. Women like Maribel Hayes don't end up with men like you, Crow. They end up with men who can match what they've got. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand you rode onto my land without being asked. The smile held. For now, it's still your land. Caleb turned his horse and walked it back toward the fence gap unhurried. He paused at the broken post and looked back over his shoulder. Fix that fence. Place is starting to look worse than it already did. Then he was gone. Elias stood in the yard for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded. The wood he'd been splitting was stacked in a crooked pile against the barn wall. The barn itself had a board loose on the south side that he'd been meaning to replace since October. The cabin behind him was small and weathered, its chimney repaired twice with mismatched stone, its porch steps worn smooth from years of boots that weren't his wife's anymore. He knew what the place looked like. He didn't need Caleb Rourke to tell him. What bothered him wasn't the insult. Insults from men like Caleb were just noise. What bothered him was the accuracy of one specific thing the man had said. Poor men didn't end up with women like Maribel Hayes. He knew that. He'd known it every single time he'd walked back from her place at dusk with the smell of a real kitchen meal still in his clothes. Every time he'd watched Rosie light up the moment Maribel appeared at their door. Every time Maribel had laughed at something he said, and he'd caught himself wanting to make her laugh again. He knew it, and he went back inside and started making breakfast anyway, because his daughter was going to wake up in 20 minutes and she needed to eat before school. Rosie Crowe was 8 years old and already too observant for her own good. She came out of her bedroom, pulling her hair into a braid she couldn't quite finish, squinting at her father's face, the way she did when she was reading something he hadn't said out loud. "Someone come by?" she asked. "Just a neighbor." "Which neighbor?" "The kind that doesn't stay long." Rosie finished her braid by feel, tugging it tight, and sat down at the table. She watched him pour the oats into the pot. She had her mother's eyes, dark and patient, the kind of eyes that waited you out. "Was it Mr. Rourke?" Elias looked at her. "What do you know about Mr. Rourke?" "Tommy Aldrich says Mr. Rourke is going to buy every ranch in the valley before spring." Tommy Aldrich is 9 years old. He heard his dad say it. Elias set a bowl in front of her. "Eat your breakfast." Rosie ate. But she kept watching him the way she always did when something was wrong, and he wasn't talking about it. 3 minutes of silence passed, which was about as long as Rosie ever lasted. "Papa, are we going to lose the ranch?" He sat down across from her. The table was small, its surface scratched from years of use, a crack running along the near edge that he'd filled with pine pitch last spring. He looked at his daughter and told her the truth, the way he always tried to not the whole truth, because she was 8, but not a comfortable lie either. "Not today," he said. "We're not losing anything today." Rosie considered that. "But maybe another day?" "Maybe another day is a problem for another day." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a real answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She went back to her oats. After a moment, she said quietly, Miss Maribel's horses got out again yesterday. The gray one and the spotted one. She was out past the east fence trying to get them back in by herself. Elias looked up. I saw from the road on the way home from school, Rosie added. She was using a rope and she couldn't get the spotted one to come. It kept moving away from her. He was already pushing back from the table. The Hayes ranch sat on the better side of the valley. Everyone in the county knew it. The land ran flat and wide where Elias's ran rocky and narrow. The grass came in thicker. The water source was reliable year-round because Maribel's late husband, Gerald Hayes, had spent 15 years securing the water rights that fed the best creek in the territory. 300 cattle, 24 horses, 4 working ranch hands. It was one of the most valuable operations in the region, and it had been left entirely to a woman who had never expected to run it alone. Maribel Hayes was 51 years old. She had brown hair gone partly silver, hands that showed the work she did despite what anyone assumed about wealthy widows, and a particular expression she wore when someone underestimated her, not anger exactly, but a kind of compressed patience, like a spring being wound too tight. She was still working the spotted horse when Elias came over the rise. He didn't say anything. He watched her for a moment first, the way she was moving, not panicking, not pulling too hard, just working the rope with short, steady movements, trying to get close without spooking the animal. She was doing it mostly right. The horse was just being a horse. He came down the slope slowly, giving the horse time to register him, and he held out his hand flat and waited. The spotted horse looked at him, looked at Maribel, walked over to Elias, and put its nose against his palm. Maribel stared. He likes salt, Elias said. You got any in your coat pocket? I know. He can smell it anyway. He just wants to check. He took the horse gently by the halter and started walking toward the gate. Which one's the gray? She's already back in. She came back on her own 20 minutes ago. Maribel was walking beside him now, her boots wet through from the grass. I had them. They were fine this morning. The latch on the east gate, it's been sticking. I'll look at it before I go. I wasn't asking you to. I know you weren't. They got the spotted horse through the gate, and Elias latched it behind them. He jiggled the latch twice, felt the way it was catching wrong, and crouched down to look at the mechanism. It was a simple fix. The pin had bent slightly, probably from someone closing it too hard in the cold. You have a pair of pliers in the barn? He asked. Top shelf, left side of the door. He was gone for 2 minutes. When he came back, she was standing exactly where he'd left her, watching him with that compressed expression. He bent the pin back, worked the latch 3 times to test it, and stood up. That'll hold until you can get a proper replacement, he said. Shouldn't be more than $1 at the hardware in town. Maribel said nothing for a moment. Then, would you like coffee? I've got work. So do I. That's why I'm asking in the morning instead of the afternoon. He almost said no again. He could see the shape of the conversation they would have. Over that coffee, the slow, careful talk that had been building between them for months now. And he wasn't sure he was ready for where it was going to go. But his daughter had seen Maribel struggling from the road and hadn't said anything until breakfast, which meant Rosie had been watching the whole situation long enough to have opinions about it. And whatever opinions his 8-year-old daughter had developed were probably not going to be convenient ones. All right, he said. Coffee. The kitchen in the Hayes house was twice the size of Elias's entire cabin. He always noticed it without meaning to the space, the shelves that actually had things on them, the stove that didn't have a cracked firebox door held together with wire. He sat at her table and felt, as he usually did when he sat at tables that weren't his, like something that had wandered in from outside. Maribel set the coffee down in front of him without ceremony and sat across from him with her own cup. Caleb Rourke came to see me yesterday, she said. Elias set his cup down. About what? About his standing offer on my water rights. And about you. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. What about me? He said. He wanted me to understand that people in the valley are talking. That my reputation is, he used the word delicate. She said it flatly, with the same tone she might use to describe something that had gone bad in the pantry. He said a woman in my position needed to be careful about the kind of company she kept. That a poor man with nothing to offer had an obvious reason to befriend a wealthy widow. Elias looked at his hands around the cup. He said it with great concern for my well-being, Maribel added. He's very good at that. Caleb Rourke can say almost anything if he wraps it in enough concern. Maribel, I told him to leave my property. He looked up. I told him, she said, that I was capable of determining who was worth my time and who wasn't, and that his concern for my reputation was about 30 years too late to be flattering. Then I stood at the door until he rode out. She picked up her coffee. I thought you should know, in case he went to speak to you next. He came this morning, Elias said, before breakfast. Something moved through her expression. What did he say? Nothing worth repeating. Elias, he told her. He kept it short, but he told her the fence gap, the easy, contemptuous tone, the implication that whatever was between them was nothing but calculation on his part. He told her the way he told her most things, straight and without decoration, watching her face while he talked. Her jaw was tight by the time he finished. He has no right, she said. He's not wrong that people are talking. People talk. People have talked about me since Gerald died, and I didn't sell the ranch the way everyone expected me to. She set her cup down harder than she meant to. They talked when I kept all 4 hands on through the drought fight 2 years ago, instead of cutting wages. They talked when I rode out to check the north herd myself, instead of sending someone. People in this valley will always have something to say about what I do. I stopped letting that determine my decisions a long time ago. It's different when it's about character, Elias said. When it's about what a man's motives are, she looked at him directly. Is it true? What? Your motives? Is any of what he's suggesting true? The question sat between them, honest and unashamed, the way Maribel Hayes asked most questions. No, Elias said. Then I don't need to hear about it again. The trouble was, it wasn't that simple, and they both knew it. What Caleb Rourke had started, he didn't finish in one morning. In a valley this size, words traveled faster than horses, and by the end of the week, the version of events circulating through Hatcher's Creek had grown considerably from the original. The way people told it, Elias Crowe had been deliberately cultivating a friendship with the wealthy widow since summer, showing up at her property with small convenient repairs, sending his daughter over to soften the woman's heart. Elias heard it from Thomas Greer at the feed store on Thursday, told in the careful, apologetic way. That meant Thomas felt bad about repeating it, but was going to repeat it anyway. I know it's not my business, Thomas said, pushing the bag of grain across the counter. I just thought you'd want to know what's out there. I appreciate it. For what it's worth, I don't believe it. I know you don't. He drove the wagon back in silence. The thing about a reputation in a small place was that it wasn't really yours. It belonged to the people around you, and they could do whatever they liked with it. Elias had built his over 20 years in the territory, a man who worked hard, paid his debts slow but paid them, never started trouble and never walked away from someone else's. That reputation hadn't made him wealthy, hadn't stopped his wife from getting sick, or saved his roof from leaking, or put more cattle in his pasture. But it was real, and it was his, and watching it being casually dismantled by a man like Caleb Rourke over something that was nobody's business felt like a particular kind of theft. He pulled into his yard and sat on the wagon bench for a minute. The east side of his cabin was where the afternoon light hit it, and at this hour it looked, briefly, almost the way it had when Clara was alive. Same angle of sun on the weathered boards, same shadow from the big pine at the corner. He hadn't planted that pine. Clara had planted it from a seedling the first year they had the place, and it was 30 feet tall now, and some mornings when the light hit it right, he still expected to see her at the window. He got down from the wagon and started unloading grain. Rosie noticed the change in him the way she noticed most things, without comment, but with careful watching. She'd taken to spending Saturday afternoons at the Hayes Ranch, something that had started informally when Maribel had offered to help her with the needlework she was struggling to learn from a book. Elias had been careful about it at first, not wanting his daughter to get too attached to something that might not last. But he'd watch Rosie come home those Saturday evenings with color in her cheeks and something lighter in the way she moved. And he hadn't said anything, because Rosie had so few things that made her lighter, and he couldn't bring himself to take one of them away. She came home the Saturday after Caleb's visit and found Elias fixing the broken porch step, which he'd been meaning to do since August. Mrs. Whitmore was at Miss Maribel's today, Rosie said, sitting on the top step with her knees together. Elias kept working. She and Miss Maribel had an argument. I was in the other room, but I could hear. He looked up. Mrs. Whitmore said. Rosie stopped. She was choosing her words the way children did when they'd heard something meant for adults. She said that Miss Maribel needed to think about what she was doing. About us, about you coming over all the time. She paused. She said people were saying you were after the estate. Miss Maribel told her that what she did with her own time on her own property was her own concern, and that if Mrs. Whitmore had actually come to be helpful, she was welcome to stay, but if she'd come to give advice, she could leave the same way she came in. Rosie considered this. Then Mrs. Whitmore left. Elias sat back on his heels. Miss Maribel came and found me in the sitting room after, Rosie said. She wasn't upset or anything. She just made us tea and showed me the proper way to do the cross-stitch on the edge without puckering. A pause. She's very good at not letting things shake her. Yes, Elias said. She is. Rosie looked at him sideways. Papa, do you like Miss Maribel? She's a good neighbor. That's not what I asked. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old with her mother's patience and her own particular brand of relentless, gentle accuracy. Go wash up before supper, he said. Rosie stood, considered pushing it, and decided against it. But at the door she turned back. I think she likes you, she said. In the way that's more than a neighbor. Then she went inside, leaving her father on his knees on the porch with a hammer in his hand and nowhere useful to look. He went to see Maribel the next morning. He'd told himself he was going to check the fence along her north pasture, which he'd noticed last week was starting to sag. But when he got there, the fence was holding, and he found himself walking to the house anyway, and knocking at the back door the way he always did, and waiting. She answered in her work clothes, her hair not yet done for the day, which meant he'd caught her earlier than she'd expected. The north fence is fine, he said. I was going to look at it, but it's holding. I know. I checked it Tuesday. She stepped back from the door. Come in. He followed her into the kitchen. The fire was going, the coffee was already made, and there was evidence of bread she'd been mixing before he knocked flour on the board. A bowl pushed to the side. I need to say something, he said. She turned from the stove. All right. He hadn't planned exactly how to say it, which meant it came out the way things usually did when he hadn't planned, plain and slightly too direct and without enough setup. If this friendship, whatever it is, if it's hurting your position in this valley, I need to know that. Because I can step back. I can stop coming around, stop bringing Rosie on Saturdays, and in 6 months people will have something else to talk about, and your name will be clear of all of it. He stopped. I don't want to. I'm telling you what I can do, not what I want to do. Maribel looked at him for a long moment. Elias Crowe, she said. Do you think I've spent 28 years in this valley, making decisions based on what other people's mouths are doing? No. Then why would I start now? Because this one is different. This isn't about your ranch decisions or who you hire or how you run your operation. This is about your personal. It's all personal, she said. All of it has always been personal. When Gerald died and I kept the ranch, that was personal. When I fought Caleb Rourke's first offer on the water rights 3 years ago, that was personal. Every single thing I've done that anyone in this valley ever had an opinion about has been personal. She crossed her arms. I am not going to manage my life based on Caleb Rourke's comfort. And I'm not going to ask you to disappear because some people who don't know either of us have decided they understand our intentions better than we do. Your reputation is mine, she said firmly, and I'll do what I like with it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up from the west, which usually meant weather by afternoon. I just didn't want you to think, he said slowly, that I haven't noticed what this is costing you. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. I know you've noticed, she said. That's not nothing, Elias. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in the morning light, and whatever had been building between them for months was very close to the surface now. Close enough that they were both aware of it, and neither of them was quite ready to name it. You want coffee? She asked. Yes, he said. She turned to the stove. The incident that the valley would talk about for years happened on a Thursday in late October at the Hatcher's Creek General Store, in front of 7 witnesses, including Thomas Greer, Agnes Whitmore, and a traveling merchant from Billings who later described the whole thing to 3 separate people in the next town. Caleb Rourke had been making a slow and deliberate point at the store counter about the sorry state of certain properties on the east side of the valley, and how it reflected on the people who let them deteriorate when Elias came in for nails. He heard the end of it. He couldn't have missed it. Caleb's voice carried when he wanted it to. Man can't keep up his own property, Caleb was saying, with his back to the door, addressing Thomas across the counter. You have to wonder what exactly he does spend his time on. Neighborly visits, I suppose. The store went quiet the way rooms do when they sense what's coming. Elias set the bag he was carrying on the nearest shelf. He walked to the counter. He stood close enough to Caleb that the other man had to turn. Caleb turned. His expression was ready, amused, the expression of a man who had calculated this moment and found the odds in his favor. "Crowe," he said. "You've said some things," Elias said, "in this store and others. About me. About Maribel Hayes. About what you think is happening between us and why." He kept his voice level. Not angry. Just clear. "I'm going to ask you once in front of these people to stop." Caleb smiled. "A man's allowed to observe what he sees." "What you're observing isn't what's there." "Then what is there?" Caleb spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable inquiry. "Because from where I stand, I see a man with a failing ranch finding reasons to spend time on a much better one. You can call that friendship. I'm allowed to call it what it looks like." The room held very still. "You think," Elias said carefully, "that because I have less than you, everything I do is about getting more? That a poor man can't value something that money isn't involved in?" He paused. "That says more about you than it does about me." Caleb's smile stiffened. "I'm not going to stop coming by Maribel's property," Elias said. "I'm not going to stop letting my daughter spend time with someone who's good to her. And I'm not going to defend myself to you or anyone else in this valley, because I haven't done anything that needs defending." He held Caleb's gaze for 3 full seconds. "But I'll say this once. If you want to make this a real dispute, about water rights, about land boundaries, about anything that's actually your business, I'll have that conversation. On honest terms." He picked up a box of nails from the shelf behind Caleb's shoulder, set money on the counter, and walked out. The merchant from Billings later said the silence lasted a full 10 seconds before anyone moved. Thomas Greer told his wife that evening that he'd never seen Caleb Rourke look quite like that before. Like a man who'd gone fishing expecting one kind of fish and had pulled up something else entirely. Maribel heard about it from 2 different people before noon the next day. She waited until Saturday, when Rosie was settled at the table with her needlework, and she went to find Elias in the barn, where she'd seen him working when she came through the gate. "You didn't have to do that," she said from the barn door. "He was mending a bridle, not looking up, I know. It might make things worse." "It might. Caleb doesn't like being embarrassed." "I know that too." She came in out of the wind and stood near the workbench. The barn smelled like horses and hay and leather and the specific dry cold of October. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He looked up then. His eyes were the serious kind of gray, the kind that didn't do much performing. "Because I was tired of walking around it," he said. "And because he was wrong, and I was the one who should have said so." Maribel was quiet for a moment. There was something she'd been working up to saying for weeks now, maybe longer, and she found herself very close to it right now in the cold barn, with Rosie 20 feet away in the kitchen, pressing careful stitches into cotton. "When Gerald died," she said, "everyone was very sorry. And then very quickly, everyone had opinions about what I should do. Sell, hire a manager, remarry someone appropriate, move closer to family." She picked a piece of straw off the workbench. "No one thought to ask what I wanted. They were all too busy being sorry and helpful in that particular way that mostly serves them." "I'm not trying to be helpful," Elias said. "I know." She set the straw down. "That's why I trust you." The barn held the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and wind against the boards. Somewhere in the house, Rosie made a small sound of satisfaction, which meant the needlework was going right. Elias set the bridle down and looked at Maribel, and she looked at him, and the thing between them that had no name yet sat plainly in the air between them. "I don't know what this is," he said, "and I'm not going to pretend I have some plan for it. I'm a man with a rocky 40 acres and a daughter to raise, and more months where the bills are tight than where they're not. I know what I am. I know what you are too," Maribel said quietly. "That's the part that worries me," he said, "because I can't figure out what you'd want with it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe I'm tired of having everything money can buy and nothing that money doesn't touch." He had no answer for that. Neither of them moved. The conversation hung between them, incomplete, and neither of them pushed it over the edge. Not today. Not yet. There was still snow to come, and trouble to come, and all the other things that would have to happen before they got to the other side of whatever this was. But the barn was warm from the horses, and through the wall came the sound of Rosie's humming, low and tuneless, which was what she did when she was happy. Elias picked the bridle back up. "You should stay for supper," Maribel said. "I've got a roast. Rosie will eat 3 plates." "Good. I made enough for 4. He nodded, and she went back to the house, and the wind pressed against the barn walls with everything the coming winter had to say. The roast that night was the best thing Elias had eaten in longer than he wanted to admit. He didn't say that out loud. He said it was good, which was the kind of understatement men like him made when they were trying not to seem too impressed by something, and Maribel accepted it with a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that told him she knew exactly what he meant. Rosie had no such restraint. She ate 2 full plates and asked for a third with no embarrassment whatsoever, and Maribel served her without comment, which Rosie clearly found entirely reasonable. By the end of the meal, Rosie had migrated from her chair to sitting on the bench beside Maribel, showing her the cross-stitch pattern she'd been working on, explaining each color choice with the serious authority of someone who had been doing this for years rather than 3 Saturdays. Elias watched them across the table and said nothing. But he noticed. He always noticed. He noticed the way Rosie angled toward Maribel without thinking about it, the way a plant grows toward the window without being told. He noticed the way Maribel listened not politely, not with the distracted half-attention adults usually gave children, but actually listened, asking questions that showed she'd heard the sentence before, following the logic of an 8-year-old's explanation as though it mattered, because to her, apparently, it did. He noticed these things, and he was careful about what he did with them. On the walk home through the cold dark, Rosie held his hand and talked about the roast and the stitching, and something Maribel had said about the way the Hayes family had first come to the territory, a story about great-grandparents and wagon wheels and a river crossing that had apparently been both terrifying and funny. Rosie loved stories that were both things at once. Pa, she said, when they were almost to their own fence. Miss Maribel looked sad tonight, when she didn't think anyone was watching. He said nothing. When you and I were talking after supper, and she was washing the dishes, I looked over and her face was just quiet in a sad way. People's faces go quiet sometimes, not like that. Rosie squeezed his hand once. I think she's lonely, Rosie. I know, wash up before bed. But she said it with the tone of a child who had made her point and knew it had landed. November came the way it usually did in the territory, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as though the cold had been waiting behind a door, and someone had finally opened it. The temperature dropped 16 degrees in 2 days and stayed there. Elias's cattle moved closer to the barn without being driven. The creek on his eastern edge developed a skin of ice in the morning that didn't fully melt by afternoon. He had 17 head going into winter. It wasn't enough to break, even if they lost more than 2 or 3, and the feed situation was already tight from the dry summer. He ran the numbers twice, the way he always did, hoping they'd come out different the second time. They didn't. He was in the barn, doing the third version of the same calculation, trying to figure out which number to believe. The one that said he'd make it, or the one that said he wouldn't, when he heard a horse at a hard run coming up his road. He came out of the barn in time to see one of Maribel's hands, a young man named Dell, pulling up at the gate with his horse breathing hard clouds into the cold air. Mr. Crowe, Dell's voice was tight. Miss Maribel sent me. It's the calf. The black one she's been watching. It went down an hour ago, and it won't get up. Elias was already reaching for his coat on the barn post. How bad? Bad enough she didn't want to wait for Doc Hennessy. He's 2 hours out, and she's not sure it's got 2 hours. Tell her I'm coming. Dell turned his horse and went back at a run. Elias saddled his own horse in 4 minutes, which was not his best time, but was honest given the cold and the fact that his hands were already stiff. He rode out without going back inside for anything else, because there was nothing inside that was going to help a sick calf, and he knew it. The black calf was 3 months old and had been one of Maribel's. She'd mentioned it twice in passing, both times with the particular care in her voice that told Elias it was one of the ones she'd been watching since birth, which happened with certain animals and couldn't really be explained to people who didn't understand it. She'd been up 3 times the previous week to check on it, a detail Dell mentioned on the way back and that Elias filed without comment. He found her in the barn on her knees in the straw beside the animal, which was lying too flat and too still, its breathing wrong, shallow, and fast with the wrong rhythm. She looked up when he came in. Her face was composed the way her face got when she was controlling it deliberately. It started this morning, she said. I thought it was just cold. I put extra straw down, gave it warm water. But by midday it wasn't eating, and by the time Dell came back from the north fence it was down. Elias crouched beside the calf. He ran his hands over its side, felt the fever in its skin through his palm, checked the eyes, the breathing, the way the leg responded when he moved it. Pneumonia, he said. That's what I thought. You have mustard in the house? Yes. And camphor oil? In the medicine box. Bring both and the oldest wool blanket you can find. And boil some water. He was already moving. And Maribel, bring your warmest coat. You're going to be here a while. She didn't argue. She went. What happened over the next 6 hours was not dramatic in the way stories usually are. There was no single moment that turned it. There was just work steady, unglamorous, cold work done in a barn, while the temperature outside dropped and the wind picked up, and the animal fought in the way sick animals sometimes did, without awareness that it was fighting, just the body doing what it could with what it had left. Elias applied the mustard poultice to the calf's chest and wrapped it in the blanket and stayed close, checking the breathing at intervals, talking to the animal in the low, even voice he used, not because he thought the calf understood, but because it was something his hands could do while his mind was tracking the fever. Maribel crouched on the other side, doing what he asked when he asked it: more heat, fresh water. Hold this corner down without any of the questions or second-guessing that would have slowed things down. Around 2 in the morning, the calf's breathing changed. Just slightly, the rhythm evened out a degree. There, Elias said quietly. Maribel had been sitting against the stall wall with her knees up and her coat pulled tight. She leaned forward. Is that maybe? Too early to say. They stayed. At 3:30, the fever broke. Not dramatically, the animal just became less hot under Elias's hand, and then less hot still, and the breathing slowed from frantic to merely tired. The calf made a small sound, different from the sounds it had been making. Maribel made a sound too. Brief, involuntary, the kind of thing that escapes before a person catches it. Elias sat back on the straw and let out a breath he'd been managing for 6 hours. She needs to stay warm until morning, he said. But I think she's through it. Maribel pressed the back of her hand against the calf's nose. The animal responded, barely, but it responded. She kept her hand there for a moment. Thank you, she said. Her voice was rough from the hours in the cold. I didn't do more than you did. You knew what to do. So did you, mostly. You had her warm and watered before I got here. That bought her time. Maribel lowered her hand and leaned back against the stall boards. In the lamplight, with her hair loose from the pins it had been in, and hay in her coat and 6 hours of worry on her face, she looked entirely unlike the wealthy widow who ran the most valuable ranch in the valley, and entirely like herself. I hate this part, she said, when you can't do anything but wait. Yeah, Gerald used to say worrying was just praying with worse results. She stopped. Sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right. You can say his name. She looked at him. It doesn't bother you? Why would it bother me? Some people get... Never mind. She looked at the calf. He wasn't good with sick animals. He was good at many things, but that one wasn't his. He'd get frustrated when they didn't improve fast enough. A pause. He wasn't a patient man. That was his worst quality, and also in some ways his best, because it meant he got things done. He built all of this in 15 years, because he couldn't stand the idea of waiting for it. You must miss him, Elias said. It came out plainly, because that was how he said things. I miss the company, Maribel said. I miss having someone in the house, someone to tell things to at the end of a day. She paused. Is that terrible? Missing the company more than the person? No, Elias said. It's honest. She looked at him sideways. Your wife. What do you miss? He thought about it, which was what he always did before he answered something real. The sound of her in the other room, he said. Not even talking. Just the sound of another person moving around. The house doesn't sound right without it. He looked at the calf, which was breathing steadily now. Rosie helps. She's loud enough for 3 people. But at night after she's asleep. He stopped. Yes, Maribel said. That's exactly it. They sat in the barn while the calf breathed and the wind ran along the walls outside. And there was something about having said those things out loud, to each other, in the cold at 3:30 in the morning with hay in their clothes that's settled between them differently from all the careful conversations they'd had in daylight. You should sleep, Elias said. I'll watch her until morning. I'm not going to sleep. Maribel, I will not sleep in the house while she's still recovering. Don't argue with me about it. He didn't argue. He got up and found an extra horse blanket on the partition wall and folded it and set it on the straw beside her without comment. She took it without comment. They stayed. By the time the gray light of morning started coming through the gap under the barn door, the calf was on her feet. Doc Hennessy arrived at 7:30, examined the calf with professional thoroughness, and told Maribel she'd done everything right, and the animal would likely make a full recovery. He looked at Elias, who was standing near the door with straw on his coat and the specific look of a man who had been awake all night. "You stayed the whole night?" Hennessy asked. The calf needed watching. Hennessy looked between him and Maribel with an expression that was professionally neutral but had something behind it. He gave his instructions, collected his fee, and left without making any observations. Maribel made breakfast. Real breakfast eggs and salt pork and biscuits that she made from scratch at 6:30 in the morning, despite having not slept, because she was that kind of woman. Elias ate it at her kitchen table and thought about all the things he hadn't said in the barn and whether he should have said them, and whether it would have been better or worse if he had. "I need to get back," he said. "My animals, I sent Dell over at first light. He's checking your morning water." He stopped. "You didn't have to do that. You spent the night saving my calf. Dell checking your water troughs is the smaller exchange by a considerable margin." She refilled his coffee without asking. "Eat the rest of those biscuits." He ate the rest of the biscuits. After he'd gone, Maribel stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out through her gate, and she let herself feel, for a moment, the full weight of what the night had been. Not just the calf. The other part. The sitting in the barn at 3 in the morning saying true things to someone who heard them without flinching. The particular relief of that. She turned from the window and went to check on the calf, because there was always more to do, and she was not the kind of woman who stood at windows too long. Word traveled, the way it always did. By the following week, the valley knew that Elias Crowe had spent the night at the Hayes Ranch nursing a sick calf. The version of it that Caleb Rourke's circle preferred didn't mention the calf at all, or mentioned it as an obvious pretext. And the version Thomas Greer's circle preferred involved words like dependable and decent, which were the words Thomas used when he was building someone's case without seeming to. Elias ignored both versions and kept working. What he couldn't ignore was Caleb Rourke appearing at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in Hatcher's Creek, where Elias had never much attended, because the membership skewed toward men with more cattle than he had, and the conversations were usually about problems he didn't have yet. He went this time because Thomas had told him quietly that there was going to be a vote on water allocation for the coming year, and that Maribel's water rights were going to come up, and that Elias might want to be there. He sat in the back. Caleb sat at the front, which was where Caleb always sat. The water allocation discussion was orderly and dull for 40 minutes, and then it wasn't. Caleb raised the question of the Hayes Creek access specifically, the downstream rights that several smaller ranchers had been using on informal arrangement for years, with Gerald Hayes' blessing, and that Caleb now suggested required formal review given the change in management of the Hayes property. "With all respect to the widow," Caleb said, in the tone he used when he had no respect for anyone in the room, "she may not be fully aware of the historical agreements attached to those rights. It would be appropriate for the association to clarify the legal position before next season's water becomes an issue." 3 men nodded. 2 looked uncomfortable. Elias knew what Caleb was doing. He was laying groundwork. Not for this meeting. This meeting was just the first shovel into the ground. He was building toward a legal challenge on the water rights, and he was doing it in public, in a way that made it look like responsible community management, rather than what it actually was. He stood up. The room turned. "Those downstream arrangements are on record," Elias said. Gerald Hayes filed the informal agreements with the county land office in 1883, and again in 1886. They have legal standing as recorded agreements, not just verbal arrangements. If the association wants to review them, the documents are available. He paused. Maribel Hayes is aware of every agreement attached to her property. She reviewed the entire land office file 2 months after Gerald died. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I appreciate the information," Caleb said. "I wasn't suggesting she was unaware." "I know what you were suggesting," Elias said. "The documents are available if anyone wants to read them." He sat down. The conversation moved on. But when the meeting ended and men were putting their coats on, Thomas Greer came and stood beside Elias for a moment. "How do you know about the 1883 filing?" Thomas asked quietly. "Maribel told me," Elias said. "She's thorough." Thomas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Caleb's not going to let this go." "No," Elias agreed. "He's not. He wants those water rights bad enough to make real trouble." "I know. You know what happens if he gets them, right? Half the downstream ranchers lose their informal access and have to either buy new rights or haul water." I know. Thomas looked at him. This is getting bigger than a property dispute. It was always bigger than that, Elias said. Caleb just prefers it when people don't notice until it's too late. He told Maribel that evening, riding over after his own chores were done, catching her before supper. She took it better than he'd expected, and worse at the same time her expression went controlled and flat, which was how her face looked when she was angry, in the way that went cold instead of hot. He's moving on the water rights, she said. He's positioning to. He's not there yet. What does he need to make a formal challenge? He'd need to argue that the recorded agreements are invalid or expired. The 1,883 filings should hold, but if he gets a sympathetic judge. Gerald chose that county office, filing specifically, because he knew this could happen someday. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the fire in the kitchen stove. He never trusted Caleb. Even when Caleb was still being friendly, Gerald said, "Watch that man. Watch him around the water." She exhaled. "I need to talk to the land lawyer in Billings. That would be my first move, too." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this since the meeting this afternoon. You went to the cattlemen's meeting." She said it as a statement, not a question, but with something in it that wasn't neutral. "Thomas said I should be there. You went because of my water rights." He met her eyes. "I went because Caleb was going to say things in that room that needed answering, and you weren't going to be there to answer them." She was quiet for a moment. The fire ticked in the stove. "Elias," she said. Then she stopped and started again. "I've been managing this property alone for 3 years. I've handled buyers and lawyers and drought, and 2 hands who quit without notice, and a fence dispute with Aldrich that took 8 months to resolve. I'm not helpless. I know that." "Then why?" "Because you shouldn't have to do everything alone." He said it plainly, the same way he'd said it to her months ago, with an axe in his hand and a log she'd been struggling with. "Not because you can't. Because you shouldn't have to." The words landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Maribel looked at him for a long time with the compressed expression she wore when she was deciding something. Not what to say, she usually knew what she was going to say. Something else. "I'm going to write to the Billings lawyer tonight," she said finally. "And I'd like you to come with me to the land office in town next week to review the filed documents." "All right. Not because I need someone to hold my hand. I know. Because you know which questions to ask, and I know which documents to look at. And between the two of us, we'll be more thorough than either one alone." "That's good thinking," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Almost. I have good thinking occasionally. More than occasionally." She looked at him for one moment more, and then she turned to the stove. "Stay for supper," she said. "There's stew, enough for 3 if Rosie's with you. She's at home." She wanted to finish her reading. Then enough for 2. She picked up the ladle. "Sit down, Elias." He sat down. Rosie noticed the shift in her father, the way she noticed most things sideways, without announcing it. He was different in the evenings now. Not happy exactly, because happy was too simple a word for it, and her father was not a simple man. But there was something in the way he moved through the cabin at night quieter, less like a man bracing against something invisible. Like a window that had been jammed shut for years, and someone had finally freed the frame enough to let some air in. She didn't say anything about it. She was 8. But she understood that some things you watched and didn't poke. She did, however, begin finishing her reading lessons at Maribel's kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, a development that had begun because Maribel had mentioned she had several books Rosie might find useful, and had escalated to Rosie simply appearing at the Hayes back door after school twice a week with her primer under her arm. Maribel never told her to stop. She never told her to come either, which Rosie respected. She just had the books on the table when Rosie arrived, and a glass of milk, and an hour of quiet kitchen time that Rosie had learned was the most productive studying she did all week. One Thursday, Rosie looked up from her book and said, "Miss Maribel, do you want to get married again?" Maribel was at the table herself, going over the ledger. She set her pen down. "That's a large question for a Thursday afternoon," she said. "I know, I just wondered." Maribel looked at her. "Why do you wonder?" "Because Papa doesn't talk about it, but I think he thinks about it. And I think you think about it too." She turned a page in her primer. "I don't mind," she added, conversationally, "if that's what you're both worried about. Rosie, I'm just saying, in case it was a concern." She looked at the book. "I know it's not up to me. I just wanted you to know that if it happened, I wouldn't be upset." The kitchen was very quiet. "You are an unusual child," Maribel said at last. Mama used to say that too. Rosie read a sentence, turned a page. She meant it as a compliment. So do I. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her reading, and Maribel sat at her ledger for a moment without doing anything with the pen in her hand. The calf recovered completely. By the second week of December, she was back with the herd, visibly unbothered by her near disaster. The way animals were immediate, forward, uninterested in what had almost happened to them. Maribel watched her from the fence one cold morning and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Gratitude, partially. Something else underneath it. She was still at the fence when Elias came over to check the south pasture, which he'd been doing every few days since the water rights meeting, building a quiet familiarity with her property that she'd stopped pretending wasn't deliberate. He came and stood at the fence beside her. She looks good, he said. She does. Maribel watched the calf move. I've been thinking about what Rosie said. On Thursday, he was still for a moment. She told me she said something. She didn't tell me what. She said she wouldn't be upset if things changed. A pause. The pasture was quiet. 2 horses were moving along the far side, their breath showing white in the cold air. The sky was the particular pale gray of a December morning that might hold snow. She's 8, Elias said carefully. She's 8 and she's right, Maribel said. And I think we've both known it for a while. And I think we're both waiting for something I don't know what. Permission, maybe. Or for the right moment. Or for the problems with Caleb to be settled first. There will always be problems. Yes, she looked at him. There will always be something to wait for, if waiting is what you're determined to do. He turned to look at her, and she looked back, and the morning cold sat around them like a held breath. I'm not a patient man by nature, he said quietly. I've just learned to act like one. I know. She turned back to the fence. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted to say it out loud. That I know what this is. Her hands rested on the top rail. And I'm not pretending otherwise. The calf at the far end of the pasture lifted her head and looked at nothing in particular, the way young animals did. Elias looked at his hands on the fence rail, and then at Maribel's hands beside his, and then at the pale winter sky. After the water rights are settled, he said, Elias, not because I want to wait, because I want to walk into whatever's next with clear ground under my feet. Not while Caleb Rourke is maneuvering around your property, and I'm spending half my thinking on that. She was quiet for a moment. Then that's a reasonable position. I know it's not. It's reasonable, she said again. I said so. But she looked at him once more before she pushed off the fence. Don't take forever. He watched her walk back toward the house, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her boots leaving clear prints in the frost, and he stood at the fence a while longer with the December air on his face and the sound of his own heartbeat, which was doing something slightly different than it usually did. He didn't move until he was sure he had himself sorted out. Then he went to check the south pasture, because that was what he'd come to do, and the pasture didn't care what was happening inside him and needed looking at regardless. The snow that had been threatening all morning finally came down at noon, not heavy, just the first cautious fall of the season, the kind that didn't commit, settling on the grass and the fence rails and the rooftops of both ranches, covering everything in a thin, clean white that made the valley look, briefly, like nothing complicated had ever happened in it at all. The lawyer from Billings arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a good day for anyone to arrive in Hatcher's Creek, because Wednesday was when the feed deliveries came through, and the main road through town was half blocked with wagons for most of the morning. His name was Arthur Pembroke, and he was a small, precise man with a leather case he carried, like it contained something fragile. And he looked at the mud on the road with the expression of a man who had agreed to come to a frontier town and was now fully understanding what that had meant. Maribel met him at the hotel and brought him to her ranch that afternoon. Elias was already there when they arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with the land office copies spread in front of him, which he'd collected from the county clerk 2 days earlier and gone through twice the night before with a lamp and a pencil, marking the sections that mattered. Pembroke looked at the documents. Then he looked at Elias. And you are? He asked. Her neighbor, Elias said. Pembroke looked at Maribel. He's also the reason I know which documents to have ready, she said. Sit down, Mr. Pembroke. We have a lot to go through. They spent 3 hours at that table. Pembroke was good, Elias could see it in the way he read, the way he stopped and backed up and read something again without embarrassment, the way he asked questions that went to the exact point without circling. By the end of the second hour, he'd confirmed what Elias had suspected. The 1,883 and 1,886 filings were solid. Gerald Hayes had done the work carefully. The informal downstream agreements were recorded and had legals standing under territorial law. However, Pembroke said, setting his pen down in the way men set pens down when a however is coming, Rourke doesn't need to invalidate the agreements to cause problems. He can challenge the primary water rights themselves. The Hayes parcel draws from Fallow Creek, which has 3 other upstream claimants. If Rourke purchases or acquires rights from any of those upstream holders, he can petition to reclassify the downstream flow and effectively reduce the Hayes allocation. Maribel was very still. He'd need to buy out an upstream holder first. Yes. Who are they? The Aldrich family holds the northernmost section. Then there's a parcel registered to a Milton Graves, and the third is... Pembroke checked his notes. A Hector Dunn, ranching the Ridge property. Elias knew Hector Dunn. He knew him well enough to know that Hector's operation had been struggling since his wife's medical bills 2 years ago, and that a man in Hector's position, offered the right price for a water parcel he was barely using anyway, might find it difficult to say no. How much time do we have? He asked. Pembroke considered. If Rourke moves fast, he could have an upstream acquisition done before the spring water allocation meeting in March. That's your real deadline. If you can hold everything as it stands through March, the Territorial Water Board will set allocations for the season, and it becomes much harder for him to challenge mid-year. March, Maribel said. 10 weeks, Elias said. They looked at each other across the table. I'd recommend filing a protective declaration with the land office, Pembroke said. Puts your intent on record and makes any challenge more visible. It won't stop Rourke, but it raises the cost of what he's doing. He closed his case. And I'd recommend knowing where the Dunn parcel stands before Rourke does. After Pembroke left, Maribel and Elias sat at the kitchen table, with the document still spread between them and the lamp burning against the dark outside. Hector Dunn, she said. I know him. Well enough to talk to him? Well enough to try. He looked at the map Pembroke had left, tracing the creek line with one finger. His situation isn't good. Rourke probably already knows that. Could we help him? His situation is there something. I don't know yet. Let me go see him first. He looked up. And Maribel, don't let on to anyone that we've been to the lawyer. Not yet, she met his eyes. You think Caleb has someone watching? I think Caleb is careful, and I think he didn't become the largest landholder in this valley by being slow. She looked at the map for a moment. I've been running this ranch for 3 years, she said quietly. I've managed drought and bad markets and 2 hands who stole equipment on their way out. But she stopped. This is different, Elias said. It's the kind of fight that can be lost quietly, without a single dramatic moment. Just paperwork and money and the right signatures in the right order. And one day you look up and the creek is half of what it was. That's exactly how he'd want it. She looked at him steadily. What do? We don't give him 10 weeks, Elias said. We move now and we move first. He rode out to the Dunn place on Friday alone, in the kind of cold that made the horse reluctant and the roads hard. The Dunn ranch was small, smaller than Elias's own, which was saying something tucked against the ridge in a spot that got half the valley's wind and a third of its sun. Hector Dunn was 53 and looked 65, a man the territory had been slowly winning its argument with for some years. He was chopping ice from his water trough when Elias rode up. Crow, he said without much surprise. In a valley this size, unexpected visitors were still the most common kind. Hector. Elias dismounted and helped him with the ice, because you didn't stand and watch a man do work you could share. They broke the surface in silence for a few minutes. How's the winter treating you? Same way it always does. Your ridge pasture holding? Barely. Hector threw a chunk of ice into the snow. You didn't come about my pasture. No. You come about the creek? Elias looked at him. Has someone already been out? Hector's jaw moved. Man named Pharaoh came by Tuesday. Said he was buying land interests on behalf of an investor. Didn't say which investor. Pharaoh works for Caleb Rourke. Hector was quiet for a moment. He threw another piece of ice. Offered me $800 for the water parcel. $800. Elias did the math without showing it. For a man in Hector's position, that was close to 2 years of solid income, maybe more given how the last winter had gone. Did you take it? Elias asked. Said I'd think about it. Hector leaned on the axe handle. What happens if I do? Rourke gets upstream rights. He can petition to reclassify the Hayes allocation in March. If that goes through, Maribel loses a third of her creek flow. Her downstream agreements to the smaller ranchers, the informal ones, they become unenforceable. The water that those families have been drawing for years gets cut. Hector was looking at the trough. I knew there was a reason he was offering above what it's worth. It's worth that much to him because of what it lets him do with it. Hector nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had known what he was going to say before the conversation started, but had needed someone to say the rest of it out loud first. My wife's bills are paid, he said. That took most of what I had from last season. If I get through spring without another loss, he stopped. I don't know. I know, Elias said. $800 would get me to fall with room left over. I know that too. They stood at the trough in the cold. Elias didn't push. He'd learned long ago that pushing a man who was already under pressure just made him dig in, even if digging in wasn't what was good for him. I'm not asking you to turn down the money and get nothing, Elias said finally. I'm asking you to wait. Give me 2 weeks before you sign anything. 2 weeks. Let me see if there's another way to make your situation work without selling to Rourke. If I can't come up with something real in 2 weeks, you sell to whoever you want, and I won't say another word about it. Hector looked at him. What are you going to come up with in 2 weeks? I don't know yet, but I'll come up with something or I won't. It was a terrible pitch, and they both knew it. It was also honest, which was the only reason Hector said yes. The drought came early that year, or what passed for drought in February. The snowpack on the mountains was thin. The creek levels were already lower than they should have been for the season, and the ranchers who watched such things were watched with the tight-eyed attention of people who'd been through a dry summer before and knew what it cost. Elias felt it in his own well first. He noticed it on a Tuesday morning when the draw came up slower than usual, and he stood at the wellhead and looked at the sky and felt the specific anxiety that came with too little water and too much sky and too many animals that needed both. He said nothing to Rosie. She was 9 and 2 months and old enough to understand most of what was happening around the ranch. But the water situation was the kind of worry that needed to stay in the adult category for now. He rode the fence line that afternoon and looked at the creek on the eastern edge of his property. Low, not critically, not yet, but low in February was a message about what June was going to say. He was still at the creek when he heard the horse. He turned and found Maribel coming along the fence from her side, her hat pulled down against the wind, her expression doing the thing it did when she'd been thinking about something hard for several hours. The creek, she said, pulling up beside him. I know. My east gauge dropped 4 inches since last week. Same here. She looked at the water, if this is what the snowpack is telling us. It's going to be a dry summer. Yeah, my herd needs. She stopped and recalculated something in her head. I'd need to reduce numbers by 30 head before June if the creek drops below the spring level. That's selling at the worst time of year. I know it is. She looked at him. How are you? My 17 head can make it. My well is the concern. He said it plainly, no dramatization. If the well drops below workable depth by July, I'll need to haul or I'll need to move animals. She was quiet for a moment. You can draw from my creek. You always could. That's not Elias. Your fence line runs 12 feet from my creek. If your well fails in July, you're not hauling water when there's a creek 12 feet away. Those are your water rights, which I have, which give me the right to extend use to a neighboring property in need, which is a thing I'm choosing to do before you try to argue me out of it. She held his gaze with that level directness she had, the kind that didn't give ground easily. Don't make this smaller than it is by arguing about it. He looked at the creek. The water moved slow and clear over the stones, indifferent to both of them. Thank you, he said. Good, now that's settled. She turned her horse. Come for supper Thursday. I want to go over the cattle numbers and see if there's a smarter way to manage the reduction. I'll be there. She rode back toward her property, and Elias stood at the creek a little longer, watching the water that was going to matter enormously to a lot of people by summer, and he thought about Caleb Rourke sitting somewhere comfortable doing his own calculations, and about Hector Dunn with his 2-week deadline, and about a little girl at school right now who didn't know her father's well was dropping. He had 2 weeks. He went home and started thinking. What he came up with was not elegant. It was the kind of solution that only worked because it was built out of things that were already true rather than things he had to invent, and it took him 6 days of thinking and 3 conversations he'd rather not have had, and 1 night where he didn't sleep at all to get there. The Dunn water parcel wasn't worth $800 to Caleb Rourke, because of what the water itself was. It was worth $800 because of what it unlocked. If Rourke never got it, the $800 was meaningless. But if someone else got it first, not Maribel, because that would just shift the target. But someone who had no dispute with Rourke and no particular strategic value, Rourke lost his upstream play entirely. Thomas Greer was the someone. Thomas had $300 in savings that he'd been holding for a horse he hadn't found yet, and a legitimate need for water access on a dry year lease that Hector's parcel could provide. If Thomas bought the parcel at $450, which was closer to its actual value, and Elias covered the difference from his own savings, which would wipe out everything he had put aside over 8 years, Hector got $500, Thomas got a useful lease, and Caleb got nothing. Thomas stared at him across the feed store counter when he laid it out. "You'd put in your own savings," Thomas said. "The $250 difference." "Yes, Elias. That's everything you have. I know what it is." "What happens to you if the summer goes bad and you need that money?" "I figure that out in the summer." He met Thomas's eyes. "Right now what I'm figuring out is March." Thomas was quiet for a long time. He straightened a stack of seed packets that didn't need straightening. He looked at the ceiling. He was the kind of man who needed to go through the whole weight of a thing before he picked it up. "What does Maribel know about this?" he asked. "Nothing yet. You're doing this for her." "I'm doing it because it's the right play," Elias said. "And because if Rourke gets upstream rights, the downstream families lose informal water access. That's not just Maribel's problem." Thomas looked at him steadily. "That's true," he said. "But it's also for her." Elias said nothing. Thomas picked up a pen. "Get Hector in here tomorrow morning," he said. "And bring whatever you've got for the $250 because I'm not carrying your share." Maribel found out 3 days later, not from Elias but from Hector Dunn, who told her when he came by to let her know the parcel was sold, and that Caleb's man Pharaoh had shown up the day after the sale with a look on his face like he'd bitten into something that tasted wrong. She came to Elias's property that evening at dusk, which she'd never done before. She'd always let him come to her, understanding without being told that there was a particular pride a man in his position needed around his own property. The fact that she came to his said something about the state she was in. He saw her coming from the barn and walked out to meet her at the gate. "You emptied your savings," she said. "Hector needed a fair price. Thomas needed the investment to work. Don't explain the mechanics to me. You spent everything you had set aside." Her eyes were direct, and something in them was upset in a way he hadn't seen before. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have offered to cover it yourself." "Yes, I would have. And then it becomes something else," he said. "It becomes you solving the problem with your money instead of it being solved." "Elias Maribel, think about what you're saying. Think about what it would have meant if I'd come to you and said, 'Here's my plan, and here's the part where I need you to fund it.' After everything Caleb's been saying about my motives." That stopped her. She was silent for a moment, and he watched her work through it, the flash of resistance, and then the understanding arriving behind it. "That's why you didn't tell me," she said. "Yes." She looked away for a moment, at the fence, at the field behind it where his cattle were settling for the night. When she looked back, her expression had shifted from upset to something more complicated. "You just spent every dollar you had," she said quietly, "for a problem that was mostly mine. The downstream families. Don't do that. Don't make it smaller." She took a breath. "That was $250, Elias. I know what $250 means to your operation. I know what it means. It means if anything goes wrong this summer, then I deal with it. That is not a plan. It's the plan I have." He said it without heat, just flat honest. "I made the choice with what I had available. I'd make it again." She looked at him for a long time in the fading light, and he held her gaze the way he always did, steady. No performance, just there. "You frustrate me tremendously," she said finally. "I know. I want to be angry at you. You can be. I can't quite manage it." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "I'm going to find a way to make this right. You don't owe me. I know I don't owe you. That's not what making it right means." She turned toward her horse. "And Elias, next time you're planning something this significant, you tell me first. Not to fund it. Just so I'm not walking around not knowing." "All right," he said. She mounted and rode back toward her own property, and he stood at his gate in the cold dusk and felt, under everything, something that was almost at peace. The fire started in the second week of July, which was the worst possible time for it, which was also the only time fires in the territory started at the worst possible time, when the land was driest and the wind was worst, and everyone's nerves were already worn from 3 months of watching the sky for rain that wasn't coming. The drought had come in the way Elias had read in the creek back in February. By May, the water levels were below what anyone had seen in a decade. By June, his well was hauling sand in the morning draw. By the first week of July, he'd been drawing from Maribel's creek for 3 weeks, which she had offered without ceremony, and which he had accepted without the argument he'd have put up in November. The valley was brown. The grass that should have been green going into summer was the color of old straw, and it crackled underfoot when you walked it, and every rancher in the area was carrying the particular tension of people who could see the danger and couldn't do anything about the largest variable, which was the sky. He smelled the smoke before he saw it. He was mending fence on the north edge of his property on a Tuesday afternoon, working in the heat that had been sitting on the valley for 2 weeks without a cloud to interrupt it. The smell came from the west, faint at first, the way smells came before they meant anything. He straightened and looked toward the mountains. The smoke column was already tall, not the thin gray of a controlled burn, the thick rolling black of something that had found fuel it liked and was consuming it without hesitation. The column rose and spread at the top in that shape that experienced eyes recognized immediately. His heart hit a different pace. He left the tools where they were and ran for the barn. He got to Maribel's inside 4 minutes. He didn't go to the house, he went to the field where Dell and the other hands were working, and he shouted from the fence line. Fire in the mountains. West side. It's big and it's moving. He looked at Dell. Get her. Dell was already running. Maribel came out of the house at a hard walk, shading her eyes toward the mountains. He watched her look at the smoke column and watched her face do what faces did when they understood something serious. How long? She asked. At this wind, with this grass? He looked at the column, estimated. 6 hours to the valley floor, maybe less. My herd is in the east and south pastures. If I move them now and keep moving. Get them as far east as you can before it gets to the valley. He was already calculating. Your barns are the problem. The house is stone on the lower half. It can take some heat. The barns are wood. I've got 4 hands. Get all of them on the north and west barn walls. Wet them down as long as you have water. I'll send Rosie too. Where is Rosie? Home. I'll get her to the Greers. Thomas is far enough east. He turned his horse, Maribel. The moment it gets to the tree line above your Northacher, you stop worrying about the property and you ride east. You hear me? She looked at him with that expression. And you? I'll be here. Elias, get your cattle moving. He wheeled his horse and went at a run. The next 2 hours were the kind that compressed time into something strange, where 30 minutes could feel like a week and a week could pass in the space between 2 breaths. He got to his own property, sent a hand with a message to Thomas Greer for Rosie scrawled on a piece of paper that just said Fire West. Take Rosie, which was all Thomas would need. He moved his 17 head himself, driving them east through his own gate and onto the road, and when they were moving, he went back for his mare and the 2 working horses, and then left his property to whatever happened next. Because there was nothing more he could do for his own small operation that mattered as much as what needed doing next door. Maribel's south barn was the greatest risk. It sat closest to the west ridge, built before Gerald Hayes had known the property well enough to avoid putting a barn at the bottom of a slope that channeled wind. Elias came back through the gate and found 2 of her hands already working the barn walls with wet burlap, which was improvised and insufficient but was what they had. He took the 3rd hand, a young man named Cord, who was strong and calm, and they moved hay away from the base of the walls, moving it into the open field where it could burn without catching the structure. The smoke was heavier now. The wind had shifted, which was both better and worse better because it slowed the direct approach. Worse because fire with a shifted wind was unpredictable fire. An unpredictable fire was the kind that came from directions you hadn't defended. Maribel appeared at the barn door covered in dust, her face tight, holding a length of rope. South herd is moving. North herd is through the east gate. Dell's driving them. Good. The north barn, the loft. Cords on it. There are feed sacks in the loft that will go up like paper if a spark. Cord knows. She stopped. She looked at him, and in that moment, with smoke making the sky brown overhead, and the sound of her cattle still moving in the distance, and the crackle of something far off getting less far, she looked entirely human, not the controlled widow, not the capable rancher, just a person who was frightened and was managing it by will. Tell me what to do, she said. Take this wall. He handed her a wet burlap sack. Work it into the base of the boards. Don't let it dry out. There's a bucket by the post. She took the sack and went to work without another word. They worked. All of them, Elias and Maribel and Cord and the two other hands, and eventually Dell, when the cattle were as far east as they were going to get. 6 people on a property built for 4, doing the work of 10, in heat that kept climbing as the afternoon moved and the smoke moved with it. The fire crested the western ridge at 4 in the afternoon. Elias saw it from the top of the barn where he'd gone to check the roof, and the sight of it, the actual wall of orange along the ridgeline, moving with the kind of authority that made human effort seem briefly absurd, hit him somewhere below the chest. He came down the ladder fast. How bad? Maribel asked. She'd been watching his face. It's at the ridge. He didn't soften it. It'll be in the low scrub within the hour. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. What do we do? Fire break. He pointed to the open ground between the south barn and the first slope. If we can get a strip clear enough, wide enough, maybe 40 feet, it won't have fuel to jump. It'll have to go around. We dig it. We dig it. With what? Shovels. Axes, our hands if we have to. He met her eyes. It's a chance, not a guarantee. She turned to the hands. Everyone on the west side. We're digging. They dug. The ground was hard from the drought, unyielding in the way baked earth got, and the sweat dried on their skin almost before it formed because the air was so dry it took everything. Elias worked the axe on the root systems that would have held the grass in place and fed any fire that crossed them, cutting a line that Dell and Cord and Maribel worked behind him with shovels, turning the earth up and clearing the dead grass away in long strips. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't air for it. 40 minutes in, Cord said, Mr. Crowe. Elias looked up and saw the riders coming through the smoke, not Caleb's men, not danger. He needed a second to understand what he was seeing: horses coming from the east, men with shovels already out, and behind them more horses, and behind them a wagon with barrels on it, which meant water. Thomas Greer was in the lead. Behind him came 4 men from town, 3 of the Aldrich family, 2 of the Whitmore boys, and behind all of them, at a pace that said he wasn't going to make a show of it, but had come anyway, Caleb Rourke with 2 of his men. Thomas pulled up at the firebreak line. He looked at the trench they'd cut and the line they had left in the smoke on the ridge. Tell us where, he said. Elias pointed. For 2 more hours the valley worked. The firebreak stretched and widened, and when it was as wide as they could make it, men with wet burlap walked the line holding it, while others wet the barn walls again and again from the barrels on the wagon. The smoke was everywhere, in the eyes, in the lungs, in the creases of every face. And the light had gone orange-brown, in the way that made it feel like the world was lit from inside something burning. Maribel was on the barn wall with a burlap sack when Caleb Rourke walked past her on his way to the firebreak. He stopped. She looked at him, streaked with ash and dirt, her hair entirely loose, nothing composed about her. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Caleb. A pause. Your south barn's going to make it. We'll see. He nodded once and kept walking. The fire reached the low scrub at 6 in the evening and found the firebreak at 6:40. It hit the cleared line and slowed. It found no grass to move through, no root systems to travel along. It ran north and south along the line looking for a crossing point and found none. And it burned through what it had on the west side of the break and pushed smoke into the already brown sky and produced a heat that the people standing on the east side felt on their faces like an open oven door. And then it turned. Not retreated. Just turned. The wind shifted again, going north, and the fire went with it, moving along the ridge above the valley instead of down into it. Then at 7:15 the rain started. Not a drizzle. Not the cautious first offering of a sky testing its options. Rain, actual, committed, cold July rain that had apparently been somewhere west of the ridge all afternoon, and had finally arrived too late to prevent everything and just in time to end it. People stood in it without moving. Some of them laughed, which was the thing people did when the body needed to express something and didn't have a better option. Cord sat down in the firebreak and put his face up to the sky. Dell made a sound that was not a word. Elias stood at the edge of the firebreak and let the rain come down on him, and breathed air that for the first time in 3 hours didn't have smoke in it. He felt Maribel beside him before he saw her. She came and stood close enough that their arms were touching, which was not something she'd done before, and looked at the smoke rising from the ridge, where the rain was meeting the fire and winning. Your barn? She asked. She meant his own property across the fence. I don't know yet. We'll go look when the rain settles. They stood together at the edge of the break in the rain, and around them, the valley's people were scattered across the wet field. Caleb Rourke and Thomas Greer, within 30 feet of each other, which would have been unthinkable yesterday. And the Whitmore boys and the Aldrich family in Dell, sitting with Cord, all of them wet and ash-covered and alive, in the particular relieved way of people who'd looked at a bad outcome and found a different one waiting. Maribel's hand found Elias's arm, not holding it, just touching, the way you touched something real when you needed to confirm it was there. He didn't pull away. The rain came down on both ranches, on the firebreak they'd cut together, on the valley that had been dry for 3 months and was drinking now with everything it had. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't anything that needed saying right at that moment that the rain wasn't already saying better. The rain fell through the night. Not gently, it came down with the conviction of something that had been held back too long and was making up for it. Drumming on the barn roofs and running in sheets off the eaves and filling the creek that had been low for 3 months in a matter of hours. By morning, the valley looked like it was trying to remember what it used to be before the drought. The grass still brown, but the air clean. For the first time since April, the sky a washed pale blue that had no smoke in it anywhere. Elias went to check his own property at first light. He'd ridden back the previous evening, after the rain settled and the ridge fire was definitively out, to find his cabin standing and his barn standing, and 4 of his 17 cattle missing. They'd wandered in the confusion of the drive, and he found 3 of them 2 miles east along the road and the 4th in the Aldrich's south field, being regarded with mild suspicion by the Aldrich horses. His fence along the west side had scorched sections where sparks had caught the dry wood before the rain, but the structure held. The fire break had done what it was supposed to do. He stood in his yard in the early morning and looked at what the fire had taken and what it hadn't, and he did the accounting the way he always did, honest, without sentimentality, without catastrophizing. The west fence needed significant repair. The small woodpile near the barn was gone entirely. A section of his pasture grass was scorched down to dirt, but the barn stood, the cabin stood, the cattle were accounted for. He'd expected worse. He'd spent the night half expecting worse. He was at the west fence with a coffee cup, looking at the scorched posts, when he heard her horse. Maribel came through the gate at the easy pace she used when she was tired, but managing it. She'd clearly slept, but not much. There were shadows under her eyes. And her hair was in a braid that was looser than her usual, and her coat was the same one she'd been wearing during the fire, still carrying the smell of smoke. She pulled up and looked at his fence line. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. Not as bad as it could have been. Your cattle? All accounted for. Took me an hour last night." He looked at her. "Your south barn? Standing. West wall has scorch damage on the lower boards. I'll need to replace 15 or 20 feet of siding." She looked at the scorched grass in his pasture. "Your feed situation, I'll need to supplement. The burnt section won't recover before fall." She nodded, looking at the damage with the same honest assessment he'd been running. 2 people who knew the difference between what could be fixed and what was permanent. "I have extra feed," she said. "More than I'll need before new grass comes in. Take what you need." He started to say something. "Don't," she said. "Just take what you need. We can settle accounts later or not settle them at all. Right now, there are more important things." He looked at her for a moment. "How much did you lose?" 12 head. She said it flat, the way you said numbers that were painful without inflection, because inflection made them larger. They panicked during the drive east and went north into the scrub. Dell found them this morning. I don't know yet if she stopped. Looked at the fence. He's still out looking. 12 head for Maribel's operation was survivable but costly. More than that, it was 12 animals she'd raised, and she was not the kind of rancher who separated the business accounting from the other kind. "I'm sorry," Elias said. "It could have been worse." She said it the same way he'd said it about his own fence, borrowing the same language of careful counting. "The barn matters more than the cattle for what Caleb's trying to do. If I'd lost the south barn, you didn't, because 40 people came and dug." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Caleb was there. I saw. He worked the firebreak for 2 hours. Him and his men." She seemed to be working through how she felt about that, which was clearly complicated. "I don't know what to make of it." "It was in the valley too," Elias said. "Fire doesn't ask who it burns. That's a generous interpretation. It's the practical one." He drank his coffee. "It doesn't change what he's been doing with the water rights. But a man can be capable of more than one thing at a time. She was quiet for a moment. You're a more measured person than I am sometimes. Only sometimes. The corner of her mouth moved. She hadn't smiled properly since before the fire, and even this was just the beginning of one, but it was real. Dell's going to need help with the north fence this week, she said. 3 sections came down in the drive. If you have time. I have time. I'll pay your rate. Maribel, your rate, Elias. I'm not going to pretend this is anything other than labor that has a fair price. She held his gaze. Don't make me fight you on the simple things. Fine, he said. Good. She turned her horse. Come for breakfast first. Rosie's already at the house. Thomas dropped her on his way to check his own fences. She's been awake since 5, and she's eaten everything I put in front of her. She does that when she's been frightened. I know. She told me she wasn't frightened at all. Very unconvincingly. Maribel looked back at him over her shoulder. Come eat, Elias, then we work, he went. Rosie was at the kitchen table with a biscuit in both hands, and a look of excessive calm on her face that confirmed everything Maribel had said about how she handled fear. She was 9 3 weeks, and she had gotten her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and some particular quality of her own that made her observe everything with quiet precision and say exactly enough and not one word more. She looked at her father when he came in. He looked at her. A conversation passed between them without any of it being spoken, and then Rosie went back to her biscuit and Elias sat down. Miss Maribel lost 12 cattle, Rosie said. I know. She told me. She wasn't sad when she told me. She was just telling me. Rosie considered her biscuit. I think she was sad before and got it over with before I got here. Probably. Papa. Are we going to be all right? The ranch. He looked at her. Yes. With the fence damage and the feed. Where did you hear about the feed? I was listening when you came in. She met his eyes without apology. Are we all right? We're going to need a good fall season. But yes, because of Miss Maribel's feed, partly. Rosie set her biscuit down with the deliberateness of someone preparing to say something they've been holding. Papa, you need to marry her. The kitchen was very quiet. Rosie, I know I said before I didn't mind, and that's still true. I'm not saying it for my sake this time. I'm saying it because she has what you need, and you have what she needs, and you're both spending a lot of energy walking around it instead of just... She picked up her biscuit again. It seems inefficient. Elias stared at his daughter for a long moment. You're 9 years old, he said. Almost. And it's still true. Maribel came in from the other room with the coffee pot and set it on the table without appearing to have heard anything, though the particular quality of her not appearing to have heard anything was itself a form of response. Rosie watched her father. Her father looked at his coffee cup. Maribel sat down and poured her own and looked at both of them. What did I miss? She asked. Nothing, Elias said. Something, Maribel said. Rosie said, I was telling Papa he should. Finish your breakfast, Elias said. Rosie finished her breakfast with the expression of someone who has made her point and is content to let it work on its own timeline. The valley spent a week recovering. It was the kind of week that happened after emergencies, full of the unglamorous labor of assessing and repairing, the going back to the normal tasks that hadn't stopped needing to be done just because something dramatic had occurred. Elias worked Maribel's north fence for 3 days, replacing the down sections alongside Dell and cord, and when that was done, he turned to his own west fence and worked it for 2 more, and when that was done, there were a dozen other smaller things waiting. But something had changed in the valley. He felt it first at the feed store when Thomas Greer greeted him by name in front of 3 other men and asked him about the fire damage, in a way that assumed his opinion on such things mattered, and the 3 other men listened when he answered. He felt it at the creek, where Hector Dunn rode by one afternoon and stopped to talk about water levels with the ease of a man who'd been on the same side of something important as you and knew it. He felt it most at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in late July, which he'd attended because Thomas had again suggested it, and this time when he came in the back, 2 men shifted to make room for him on the bench near the front. The water allocation vote went through without challenge. Caleb Rourke was there, and Caleb Rourke said nothing about the Hayes water rights. And when the meeting was over and men were putting coats on, Caleb came and stood near Elias in the way of a man who has something to say and hasn't entirely worked out how to say it. Your firebreak saved Hayes' south barn, Caleb said. Everyone's firebreak, Elias said. Caleb looked at him with an expression that was harder to read than his usual ones. You're not going to make this easy. Make what easy? acknowledging that you're a harder man to dismiss than I thought you were. Elias looked at him evenly. Did you come to apologize, Caleb? Because if you did, I'd rather you just say it plainly. Caleb's jaw moved. He was a man who did very few things plainly, and the request visibly cost him something. I made assumptions about your motives, he said finally, and I said them out loud in places where they did damage. A pause. I was wrong. Elias looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. That's it? What else do you want? Caleb stopped. Never mind. We're not going to be friends, Caleb. We don't want the same things, and we don't see the valley the same way, and that's not going to change. Elias picked up his hat. But you can leave Maribel's water rights alone, and you can stop spreading stories about my motives, and we'll manage to coexist without any more theatrics. Caleb looked at him. The water rights. Leave them alone, Elias said. Not threatening. Just clear. The upstream play is gone. You know it is. Anything else you try will end up at the land office or worse, and the whole valley just watched you dig a firebreak beside me. So the story of what kind of man Caleb Rourke is has gotten more complicated. You don't want it getting more complicated than that. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then, you're not what I thought you were. No, Elias agreed. He put his hat on. Neither are you, as it turns out. He walked out, and behind him, the meeting hall went back to its normal sounds, and outside the air was clean, and the sky was clear, and the valley looked, for the first time since spring, like a place that had come through something and was still standing. The thing that happened with Maribel was not dramatic. It didn't have a single moment that could be pointed to afterward as the turning point, no declaration made in weather or in firelight, nothing cinematic. It happened the way most real things happened gradually, and then all at once, and when it was done it was obvious that it had been inevitable. It was an August evening, 3 weeks after the fire. They were at his kitchen table, his, not hers, which had become a more usual thing since the fire had rearranged the careful distances they'd been keeping. Rosie was asleep. The dinner dishes were done, and the coffee was made, and the lamp was turned down low, and Maribel was looking at the feed accounts he'd been trying to reconcile with the burned pasture numbers. You're $20 short for October, she said, without looking up. I know. Your yield estimate on the south pasture is optimistic. I know that too. She set the paper down and looked at him. He was sitting across the table in the way he always sat at tables, like he was ready to get up and do something, never fully settled, which was the way ranch life shaped a person. I've been thinking, she said. About the pasture? About the fence. He looked at her. The fence between our properties, she said. The one you've been maintaining from your side, and I've been maintaining from mine. She kept her eyes on him with that level directness. It seems like a lot of work for a line that doesn't mean very much anymore. Elias was very still. I'm not talking about the fence, he said. I know you're not. The lamp made shadows on the walls of the cabin, and outside the night was full of the sounds of an August that had decided, finally, to cool slightly crickets and the far-off sound of cattle and the wind coming easy through the valley the way it came after rain. Rosie thinks we're being inefficient, he said. Rosie is correct. She's 9. She's correct anyway. Maribel folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Elias. I'm not asking you to make any kind of decision. I'm just saying what I think is true, because I've spent most of my life not saying things I think are true and waiting for the right moment, and I've found that the right moment has a habit of not coming unless you make it. He looked at her hands on the table, her hands that had worked his sick calf through a night, that had swung wet burlap at his barn wall in a fire, that had sorted through land office documents and poured coffee and braided Rosie's hair on 3 separate Saturday mornings when he'd been late coming back from the north fence. I'm not asking you either, he said. I'm not in a position tonight to ask you what I'd want to ask. I know, but I want to. Eventually, I want you to know that. She nodded once. Not dramatically, just a nod that meant she'd heard him and was keeping it. Eventually, she said, when I can do it right. And what does right look like to you? He thought about it. Coming to you with something more than a broken fence and 17 cattle and a 9-year-old who's already decided the outcome. Maribel looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Elias, the fence doesn't matter to me. The cattle don't matter to me. And Rosie has better judgment than most adults I know. She picked up the feed account paper again. Let's get your October numbers sorted out. And then I'm going to ride home. And you're going to think about whatever it is you need to think about. And when you're ready, you know where I live. He almost said it then. He could feel the words, the shape of them, How they'd sound in this kitchen with the lamp low and his daughter asleep in the other room. He didn't. Not because he wasn't ready, but because he wanted to do it at a moment that wasn't tucked into the end of an accounting discussion, and he thought Maribel deserved better than that. October numbers, he said. October numbers, she agreed. They worked for another hour. She rode home at 9. He stood at the cabin door and watched her light cross the dark between their properties and then disappear through the gate. And he stood there a while longer with the night air on his face, thinking about what he had and what he didn't, and what he was going to do about the distance between the two. He talked to Thomas Greer on a Wednesday, which was what he did when he needed to say something out loud to someone who wouldn't turn it into gossip. Thomas was behind the feed store counter, doing inventory, and he listened the way Thomas listened without interrupting, without his expression changing much, just steady attention while Elias laid it out. I want to ask her to marry me, Elias said, and I keep finding reasons to wait. What reasons? The ranch isn't— Your ranch is standing. It's modest, but it's yours and it's standing. I have nothing to offer her financially. She has plenty financially. That's the problem. Thomas set down his pencil. Is it a problem she's identified or one you invented? Elias looked at him. Because Maribel Hayes has been managing her own assets for 3 years. And she's done it well, Thomas said. She doesn't strike me as a woman who needs a man to bring money to the table. She strikes me as a woman who'd like a man who brings something else. He picked the pencil back up. You've spent 8 months bringing something else. You know that. The valley watched you dig a firebreak in front of a wildfire, Thomas said. I don't think the valley's objection is what it was 6 months ago. Elias was quiet for a moment. I don't have a ring. There's a jeweler in Billings. That's a 2-day ride. Then it's a 2-day ride. Thomas looked at him over the counter. Elias, what are you actually afraid of? The question sat in the air of the store, between the seed packets and the feed sacks and the smell of dried grain. That it changes what we are, Elias said. What it's been. This thing between us it's been good. It's been the best thing in my life in years. And I don't want to put a formal shape on it and find out the formal shape doesn't fit. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's a real fear, he said. It's also the fear that keeps a man standing at the edge of something good for the rest of his life without ever getting into it. He went back to his inventory. Take the 2 days. Go to Billings, come back with the ring. The rest of it will work out, or it won't, but at least you'll have done the thing. Elias left the store, stood on the street for a moment in the August heat, and made up his mind. He rode to Billings and back in 2 days, and came home with a ring that was simpler than what the jeweler had first shown him, and better for it, a narrow gold band with a small inset stone, the kind of thing that could be worn while working without catching on everything, which he'd thought about because Maribel wore work clothes more than dress clothes, and he wanted it to make sense on her hand in the actual life she lived. He didn't tell Rosie. He was fairly certain Rosie already knew, or suspected, or had decided, but he kept it to himself for the 4 days between Billings and the evening he'd chosen, which was a Sunday when Maribel had come to dinner at his place, and Rosie had been put to bed at 8, and the house was quiet. He brought out the whiskey that he kept for occasions, which she knew was unusual for a Tuesday dinner, except this was a Sunday, and that was even more unusual, and she looked at the 2 glasses on the table, and then at him. Something's happening, she said. Yes. She sat down slowly. He sat down across from her. He didn't get down on one knee because the floor of his cabin was uneven, and it seemed like the wrong kind of formal for the two of them, who had been formal and informal in various combinations for almost a year and had worked out what fit. He just sat across from her, with the ring in his front pocket and his hands on the table. Maribel, he said. Yes, she said. Then she seemed to realize what she'd said and added, I heard you. I'm listening. He almost laughed. He held it back because he was in the middle of something, but it was close. I don't have a speech, he said. I had one in my head on the ride back from Billings, and I've lost most of it. Her expression did something complicated. You went to Billings 2 days ago. For the yes. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were doing something that was not quite tears, but was the thing before tears, which was the most emotion he'd seen from her in any direction. He took the ring out and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. I know what I have and what I don't have, he said. And I know you don't need what I don't have. But I want to ask you anyway, because what I can give you is the thing I've been giving you for the last year. My time, my word, my work, whatever you need of me. He looked at her steadily. And Rosie, who already considers this a settled question. Maribel made a sound that was not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. I noticed she made herself very scarce after dinner. She's been very careful not to interfere in the process. She interfered a great deal, Maribel said. She did. Maribel reached out and picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers, looking at the way it caught the lamplight. Her hands were steady, which was just who she was even now, even with this. Elias Crowe, she said, I have been waiting for you to get to this question since February. When you said eventually, I started waiting then. He looked at her. That was 6 months ago. Yes. You're not a fast-moving man. I wanted to do it right. I know. She set the ring down and reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her grip was firm and warm and entirely real. Ask me the question. Will you marry me? Yes, she said, immediately and without hesitation. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and the lamp burned low on the table between them, and from the back room came the very obvious sound of Rosie not moving at all, which meant she'd been awake and listening for some time. Rosie, Elias said. Silence. Rosie. A pause, then very small footsteps, and the door to the back room opened 2 inches. One eye appeared in the gap. She said yes, Elias said. The door opened fully. Rosie stood in the doorway in her nightgown with her braid half undone, and an expression of profound, unconcealed satisfaction. I know, she said. I heard. She looked at Maribel. Are you going to live here, or are we going to live there? Rosie, Elias said. It's a practical question. It's the middle of the night. It's 9 o'clock. Rosie looked between them. I'm just thinking about the logistics. Maribel was smiling fully now, the real version, the one that reached her eyes. We'll work out the logistics, she said. Come here. Rosie crossed the kitchen and let Maribel put an arm around her, and she stood there with the contained satisfaction of a person whose assessment of a situation had been proven correct, which was, for Rosie, one of the better feelings available. The news reached the valley in the way news always did in pieces, at different speeds, through different mouths. Thomas Greer heard it first, because Elias told him first, and Thomas received it with a quiet smile and a handshake that lasted longer than handshakes usually did, and said everything he wasn't the type to say out loud. Agnes Whitmore heard it third or fourth, and came to find Maribel at the dry goods store the following Tuesday, with an expression that mixed genuine warmth with the residue of all the opinions she'd had earlier in the year, and to her credit she led with the warmth. I'm glad for you, Agnes said. I mean that. I know you do, Maribel said. Agnes stopped, rearranged herself. I may have listened to certain people more than I should have earlier this year. Agnes, it's past. I want you to know I never actually believed. I know you didn't. Maribel put a hand briefly on the woman's arm. Come to the wedding. Bring your husband. That's all I want from you. Agnes came to the wedding, as it turned out. Most of the valley did. Caleb Rourke heard it from his foreman and said nothing in response, which was itself a kind of response. He did not come to congratulate anyone. He also made no moves on the Hayes water rights for the remainder of the year or the year after, and the reasons for that were various and not all of them charitable, but the effect was the same. The water rights stayed with Maribel. The creek ran clear. What the valley noticed in the weeks between the announcement and the wedding was the change in how Elias Crowe moved through it. He'd always been respected in a quiet, unremarkable way, the kind of respect given to men who did their work and paid their debts and didn't cause problems. But respect and regard were different things, and what he'd had before the fire was the first kind. After the fire break, and the sick calf and the cattleman's meeting, and 8 months of quite determined presence in situations that didn't require him but that he'd shown up for anyway, what he had was closer to the second. Men stopped him on the street to ask his opinion about the creek levels for the coming season. The Aldrich boys asked him to look at a fence design they were considering. Thomas Greer started, without making any announcement of it, referring customers with ranch problems to Elias as someone worth talking to. Elias noticed all of it and said nothing about it, because he was not the kind of man who commented on such things. He just showed up to the conversations when people brought them and gave what he actually thought and went back to his work. His work, after the announcement, included more time on the Hayes property than on his own, which made logistical sense. Her operation was larger and needed more hands, and the fence between them was increasingly a formality that required maintenance more out of habit than necessity. He was working the gate on her east fence one afternoon when Dell came over with water and stood for a moment. For what it's worth, Dell said, The hands are glad. About the wedding. Elias looked at him. Miss Maribel's a good boss, Dell said. But she's been carrying a lot alone. It's good that she'll have. He stopped, apparently reaching the edge of what he was comfortable articulating. It's good, he said. Thank you, Dell. Dell nodded and walked back toward the barn, and Elias went back to the gate. And the afternoon was warm and clean, and the creek was running higher than it had in months. And the grass in the south pasture was coming back from the fire in the particular stubborn way that grass came back. Not asking for acknowledgement, just growing because that was what it did. He stood at the gate and looked across the combined run of both properties, his to the east, with its modest cattle and its repaired fence and its weathered cabin, hers to the west, with the larger herd and the good barns and the house that had been quiet for 3 years. He thought about his wife, not with grief exactly more, with the complicated tenderness of someone who has passed through a hard country and arrived somewhere unexpected. Clara had planted a pine tree from a seedling, and it was 30 feet tall now, and it would grow in front of his cabin whether he stayed or went. And he'd decided he wanted it to grow in front of a home that had people in it. He went to find Maribel, who was in the north barn doing inventory, which was where she usually was on Thursday afternoons. She looked up when he came in. Gate's done, he said. Good. She made a note in her ledger. Rosie asked me this morning whether she could call me something other than Miss Maribel after the wedding. He stopped. What did you tell her? I told her she could call me whatever felt right to her. She looked up. She said she'd think about it. She'll think about it for 2 weeks, and then announce a decision like she came to it just now. That's my read, too. Maribel set the ledger down. Elias, are you nervous? About the wedding? About the wedding itself? About any of it? He considered this honestly, because she'd asked honestly, and she could always tell when he wasn't. A little, he said. Not about you. About whether I'm going to be enough for the life you've built here. She looked at him with the expression she'd been wearing since February, the one that was steady and patient and entirely certain. I've had enough money, she said. I've had enough property. I've had enough of everything that's measurable. She came around the partition to where he was standing. You know what I didn't have enough of? Maribel. Someone who stays, she said simply. That's all I wanted. Someone who shows up and stays. He looked at her in the barn's afternoon light, with hay on her coat, and the ledger under her arm, and her silver-brown hair loose, where it had come out of the pins. And he thought that this was the real version of a person, not the widow managing an estate, not the wealthy rancher the valley talked about, just this woman in a barn on a Thursday, telling him the truth without decoration. I can do that, he said. I know you can. She handed him the ledger. Hold this while I check the north stalls. He held the ledger. She went to check the stalls. Outside, the creek ran full, and the valley went about its business in the late summer light, and both properties hummed along on either side of a fence whose gates were always open. They set the wedding for the 3rd Saturday of October, which gave them 6 weeks to prepare, and the valley 6 weeks to form opinions about the arrangements, which did with the enthusiasm of a community that had been starved of good news for most of the summer. The preparation was not romantic. It was practical in the way that everything in their lives was practical, a list of things that needed to be done, divided between 2 people who were good at dividing work without making it a negotiation. Maribel handled the food and the gathering space and the question of who to invite from her late husband's family connections, which was a delicate matter she managed with the same efficient directness she brought to water rights disputes. Elias handled the structural question of where to hold it, which turned out to be the open ground between the 2 properties, the flat stretch just east of the old fence line that got the afternoon light and was large enough for the number of people Thomas Greer had predicted would come. You're going to have more than you invited, Thomas told him, without apology. That's just how it works here. How many more? I'd planned for 20 extra. Thomas, the valley's invested in this at this point. People want to see how it ends. Elias looked at him. It's not a story. Everything's a story, Thomas said, especially the ones happening to you. He wasn't wrong. The fire had done something to the narrative the valley had been telling itself about Elias Crowe, and Maribel's taken the version, where he was a poor man angling for a rich widow's assets and replaced it with something more complicated and harder to dismiss. What the valley had watched was a man stand in front of a fire and organize the defense of someone else's property, and then step back when it was done without taking credit for any of it. That was a different story, and the valley, to its credit, had updated. The fence that ran between the two properties became the subject of a conversation neither of them had planned. It happened on the Thursday before the wedding, when Elias was walking the line-checking posts a habit, the kind of thing his hands did when his mind was elsewhere, and Maribel came to walk it with him, because she'd seen him from the house and come out, the way she did things now, without announcement or ceremony, just present. They walked in silence for a while. The posts were sound. The wire was solid where Dell had replaced sections after the fire. "Are we going to take it down?" Maribel asked. He looked at her. After, she said, "Once it's official. Some people do. When two operations become one, the fence in between is just maintenance for no reason." He thought about it. The honest answer took a moment to find. "I think I'd like to leave it," he said. She looked at him, not surprised but curious. "Not because I want a line between us," he said, "but because I built my side of it. And my father helped me build the corner posts, the summer before he died, and Clara planted climbing roses on the south section that still come back every spring." He stopped. "Taking it down feels like erasing something. I'd rather just keep the gates open." Maribel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the right answer." "You think so? You don't want to pretend the past didn't happen. You just want to stop letting it close things off." She looked at the fence line. Gerald built his original north fence with his brother, who died in '79. "I've repaired it 3 times, and I've never once thought about taking it down." She paused. "I think that's what the living owe the dead sometimes. Not grief. Just keeping the things they built standing." He nodded. They kept walking. The roses on the south section were done for the season bare canes now, brown and dormant, the way they looked every October before they came back in May. Clara had put them in the spring they'd moved to the property, before Rosie was born, when both of them had believed without evidence that things were going to work out, and the roses had continued believing it after Clara was gone, coming back every May with the dogged optimism of plants that hadn't been told to stop. Maribel reached out and touched one of the canes as they passed. "These yours?" she asked. "Clara's." She looked at the canes for a moment. "I'll make sure they get covered before first hard frost." He looked at her. "Climbing roses need protection in the first cold snap," she said. "You need burlap around the base and a few inches of mulch. Otherwise the roots shock." She kept walking. "I'll do it Friday." He said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he was feeling, so he just walked beside her and let the October afternoon do its work. The night before the wedding, Elias sat on his porch alone. Rosie was asleep. The cabin behind him was quiet. The moon was up, and the valley was silver and still, and the smoke smell from the summer fire was finally gone from the air it had taken until September, but the clean cold of October had finished the job. He sat and thought, the way he allowed himself to do late at night, when there was no one watching and no work immediately waiting. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in this yard in early winter, watching Caleb Rourke ride away through the gap in the fence, and the version that existed now, and how different those two men's sense of what was possible had been. He didn't believe things happened for reasons. He'd seen too much of the territory's indifferent machinery, the droughts that came without warning, the fevers that took the wrong people, the fires that chose randomly what to spare and what to take, to believe that a plan was operating underneath. What he believed was that people made choices, and the choices accumulated, and what looked like destiny from the outside was usually just the long consequence of a series of small decisions made in honest moments. He'd decided to put down the axe and not say anything to Caleb Rourke the first morning. He'd decided to go over and help with the spotted horse. He'd decided to stay through the night with the calf. He'd decided to spend his savings on Hector Dunn's water parcel. He'd decided to ride to Billings. None of those were grand gestures. Most of them hadn't felt like much at the time. They'd just been the thing that seemed true to do, in the moment it needed doing. What he understood now, sitting on his porch the night before his wedding, was that this was actually what a life was made of. Not the dramatic moments, though there had been those too. The fire and the water rights, and the things said in public that couldn't be taken back, but the ordinary decisions made in ordinary moments, the accumulated weight of showing up, the long patience of treating another person as worth the full investment of your attention. The door opened behind him. Rosie came out in her nightgown and sat beside him on the step, which she still fit on exactly, her shoulder against his arm. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Neither are you." They sat. "Papa," she said, "are you nervous?" "Yes." "About tomorrow or about everything?" "Both," he said. "Mostly about everything." She considered this. The moon was high, and the cattle were still on both properties, and the creek could just be heard from here, which it could only be heard when the night was very quiet. She loves you, Rosie said, in case that helps. It helps. And I think you love her. I know I do. Rosie nodded, as though this confirmed a calculation she'd been running. I've been thinking about what to call her, she said. I heard. I didn't want to just pick something. It seemed like it should be right. She pulled her knees up. I think I want to call her Mama. Not because she replaces anyone, but because that's what she is. She looked at her father sideways. Is that all right? With you and with... She stopped. She meant Clara. She didn't say it because she didn't need to, the same way Elias didn't say it, the same way both of them lived around the space of it, without treating it as a wound that couldn't be looked at. Yes, he said. It's all right with me. Do you think it's all right with her? I think, he said carefully, that your mother was the kind of person who wanted good things for you. And I think she'd want you to have everything good that's available. He put his arm around her, including a word for someone who takes care of you and means it. Rosie leaned into him. They sat in the moonlight for a while longer. Papa, she said finally. This is the happiest the house has been in a long time. He held her tighter briefly and didn't say anything, because some things didn't need answering. Go to sleep, he said. I know. She stood and went to the door. Paused. Papa. She was going to say yes from the beginning. You know that, right? You could have asked her in February. Rosie, I'm just saying. 6 months. She shook her head with the world wariness of a child who has witnessed adult inefficiency and found it trying. Good night. Good night. The door closed. He sat a while longer, and then he went inside, and he slept better than he had in years. The wedding was imperfect in a dozen small ways that would be told and retold for years by the people who were there. The table where the food was laid out lost a leg halfway through the afternoon and had to be propped with a fence post that Thomas Greer found and contributed without ceremony. Rosie, in her role as the person carrying the flowers, dropped approximately half of them before she reached the makeshift altar and picked them up with a practicality that made Merrill people love her more than she already did. The minister from Hatcher's Creek, who was supposed to say the words, arrived 40 minutes late because his horse had thrown a shoe on the eastern road and arrived out of breath and apologetic, and conducted the ceremony with a piece of mud still on his left boot that he didn't notice until he was halfway through. The wind came up halfway through and took Agnes Whitmore's hat, and the hat traveled 15 feet before Cord caught it, and Agnes thanked him with such genuine relief that Cord turned red and looked at his boots. None of it mattered. What mattered was that the valley had come Thomas Greer and his wife in the front, the Aldrich family in their good coats, Dell and Cord and the other Hayes hands, Hector Dunn, who had ridden 2 hours and arrived with his hat in his hands and a look of quiet gratitude that said he understood what had been done for him and hadn't forgotten it, the Whitmore family, the men from the Cattlemen's Association who had watched Elias stand up to Caleb Rourke in a feed store and decided something about his character from that. 43 people total, which was 22 more than had been formally invited, just as Thomas had predicted. Caleb Rourke did not come. But the morning of the wedding, a hand delivered a note to Maribel's door. The note was brief. It said, "Congratulations on your marriage. I will not be at the creek allocation hearing in March. CR." It was the most Caleb Rourke was capable of, given who he was and what he'd done, and Maribel read it twice and put it in her coat pocket and didn't mention it until later. When the minister finally said the words and they were said, Elias put the ring on Maribel's hand and she looked at it for a moment, this simple, practical ring on her working hand, and then she looked at him, and neither of them performed anything for the crowd around them. They just looked at each other the way two people looked, when they had come through something long and difficult together and arrived, finally, here. Rosie stood beside her father and cried, which surprised her, because she'd been quite certain she wasn't going to cry. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked around to see if anyone had noticed and found that several other people were also crying, which made her feel better about it. She called Maribel Mama for the first time an hour later, in the middle of a conversation about whether the food table needed more bread, without ceremony or announcement. She said it and kept talking, and Maribel stopped hearing the rest of the sentence because her attention had gone entirely to that one word. She looked at Rosie. Rosie looked back, steady and matter-of-fact. "Is there more bread?" Rosie repeated. "In the kitchen," Maribel said. Her voice was entirely level. "Third shelf." "Thank you," Rosie said and went. Maribel stood at the table for a moment, with the October wind in her hair, and the sound of her wedding around her, and something in her chest that was very full, and didn't have a simple name. Elias appeared at her shoulder. "You all right? She called me." "I know, I heard." She just said it and kept going. "That's Rosie." Maribel looked at him. "How is she so certain about everything?" "I've been trying to figure that out. For 9 years," he said. "I'll let you know when I work it out." She laughed. The real laugh. The one that came from somewhere uncalculated. He put his hand at the small of her back, briefly, not making a show of it, and then someone called his name from across the yard and he went, and she watched him go toward a group of men who wanted to talk about the fall water levels, which was, she supposed, exactly who she'd married a man, whose neighbors wanted to ask him things, who knew enough to be worth asking, who would stop and listen and give his honest read and then come back to her. That was what she'd wanted. Not management, not rescue. Not someone to take the weight of the estate off her hands. Just that someone whose presence in a place made the place better, and who came back. The question of where to live was settled in the practical way. Most of their questions got settled. His cabin was smaller and farther from the main operation. Her house was larger and better positioned. They moved Elias and Rosie's things into the Hayes house over 2 weekends in early November, a process that was occasionally funny and occasionally complicated and never once smooth. The pine tree Clara had planted stayed where it was, in front of the cabin, which Elias kept standing and maintained. He planned to use it as a working cabin eventually, extra storage and shelter for hands during hard weather. The roses on the fence's south section got their burlap and mulch on the Friday before first frost, exactly as Maribel had said they would. His 17 cattle joined Maribel's rebuilt herd. She'd replaced 8 of the 12 lost in the fire by November, sourcing from a rancher 2 valleys over who owed Thomas Greer a favor, which was how a lot of things in the territory got done. The combined herd was smaller than it had been before the fire, but healthier, and the water situation was resolved through the full creek flow that the wet fall had restored, and Caleb Rourke's retreat from the upstream strategy had guaranteed. Elias became, without announcement or title, the working partner of the Hayes Ranch operation. Not the owner that was Maribel's name on the deed, as it had always been, and neither of them saw any reason to change it. But he was the person Dell and Cord and the other hands came to for daily decisions, the person who rode the fence line and checked the water levels and negotiated the hay contracts. While Maribel kept the accounts and managed the legal matters and made the decisions that required the kind of patience and long view thinking she was better at than him. They argued sometimes. More than they had as neighbors, which was the natural consequence of sharing the same house and the same operation and the same daughter, whose opinions on ranch management were becoming, as she approached 10, increasingly specific and increasingly hard to dismiss. The arguments were the kind that happened between people who both had strong views and neither of whom backed down easily. And they were, mostly, useful the arguments that made the decision better, because both sides had been properly heard. They also wasted time disagreeing about things that didn't matter, and then had to acknowledge it, which was its own kind of education. He was not easy to live with, entirely. He was quiet in ways that could read as distant, and he had the rancher's habit of starting projects at inconvenient hours and the particular stubbornness of a man who had managed alone for years and had to consciously remember that management was now shared. He forgot to tell her things he assumed she already knew, and he assumed she knew things she hadn't been told, and this caused 2 significant arguments in the first 3 months, both of which ended with the same conclusion. He had to say the thing out loud because she wasn't inside his head, and he'd spent too many years being the only person in his own head, and had gotten lazy about narrating it. She was not easy to live with entirely, either. She had opinions she stated as facts when she was tired, and a tendency to solve problems before the other person had finished explaining them, and a history of managing alone that sometimes made collaboration feel like oversight to her, even when it wasn't meant that way. She overworked. She took things on before asking for help, not from pride exactly. She was past the kind of pride that was just fear, but from habit. From 3 years of being the only person available, and unlearning it took time. They were both imperfect in specific, particular ways, and the work of the marriage was partly the work of learning, which imperfections were going to require active management, and which were just the texture of who the other person was, And which ones deserved patience, and which ones deserved the conversation that said this needs to change. They had those conversations. That was the thing. Neither of them walked away from the harder ones, which was itself something the basic willingness to stay in the room when the room was uncomfortable. Rosie watched all of it with her usual lateral, patient attention and adapted to the new household with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting for it longer than even she'd admitted. She called Maribel Mama without self-consciousness by the second week and never reversed it. She negotiated a shelf in the Hayes house's study for her books and a hook by the back door for her coat and a standing arrangement about which days were her responsibility to collect eggs from the small henhouse Maribel kept by the garden. And she settled into the new shape of her life with the same practical certainty she'd brought to the cross-stitch and the reading lessons and every other thing she'd decided she was going to do. She asked Elias one evening, about a month into the new arrangement, whether he missed the cabin. Some, he said. The quiet, the familiarity. You know a place a certain way when you've lived in it long enough. The new place, I still reach for the lamp switch on the wrong side. Rosie nodded. I miss my window, she said, the one that faced east. I could see the creek from it in the morning. She thought about it. But I like my new room. And I like hearing the house sound like more than just us. Yeah, he said. So do I. The March water allocation meeting came and went without incident. Caleb Rourke's absence from the challenge was noted by the board and by the people who'd been watching the situation, and the Hayes water rights were confirmed for the season without opposition. The downstream informal agreements that Elias had fought to protect back in that November meeting remained intact, and the families who depended on them continued drawing their seasonal water without needing to understand fully how close they'd come to losing it. Hector Dunn shook Elias's hand outside the land office after the meeting. He held it for a moment. I know what you spent, he said. That winter. The savings. It worked out. It worked out because you spent it. Hector looked at him directly, the way people looked when they'd been carrying something and wanted to put it down properly. I want to give it back. I've got a better season behind me, and I want... Hector. Elias shook his head once. Keep it. It was $250. And you've got a ranch to run and a dry year behind you and probably another one coming eventually. He met the older man's eyes. Keep it. Use it for something that needs doing. That's all I wanted it for. Hector looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the handshake ended, and they went their separate ways, and the money stayed where it was, doing the quiet work that money did when it ended up in hands that needed it. That spring, the climbing roses on the south fence section came back. They came back the way they always did, without drama, without announcement, just new green at the nodes one morning in May, when the air had finally committed to warmth. Maribel saw them first, coming back from the morning check on the cattle, and she stopped at the fence and looked at them for a moment. Elias was at the well when she called to him. Your roses, she said when he came over. He looked. The new growth was small but definite 3 or 4 nodes on each cane, putting out the tentative green of early spring, the roses doing what they did because it was what they did. Claire used to watch for them, he said, every May. She'd go out in the morning and check and then come in and tell me they were back. How many springs? 8. From the first one to the last one she saw. He looked at the canes. Then Rosie took it over. She's been checking them every May since she was 4. Maribel looked at the roses and then at the fence line that ran between the two properties, its gates propped open in the easy permanent way they'd been since October. She thought about all the things this fence had held and divided and witnessed the morning Elias had taken the axe from her hands, the night they'd stood at opposite sides of the kitchen saying true things, the evening she'd ridden to his gate in the dusk and said what needed saying, the fire and the rain and the long careful approach of two people who'd both been burned before and were trying not to flinch. I like them, she said. They'll be full in 6 weeks. They're a mess of thorns, but the flowers are worth it. Most worthwhile things are thorny, she said. Not philosophically, just as a plain observation, the way she said most things. Yeah, he agreed. That's been my experience too. They stood at the fence in the May morning with both properties running behind them, and the creek audible in the good full way it ran in spring, and Rosie's voice came from somewhere near the barn, talking to one of the horses, which she did, conducting full conversations with animals that didn't respond in kind and didn't need to. This was the life. Not the version that would make a good story in the telling, though it had been that too, briefly and at high cost, but the daily one, the ordinary one, The one built out of water rights and fence posts and feed accounts, and a child checking rose canes every May. The one that asked of its people not heroism, but presence. Not grand gestures, but the steady, unglamorous willingness to stay. Elias had learned something in the last year that he hadn't known how to say when it was happening, and still wasn't sure he could say fully now. He'd learned it through all of it, through the embarrassment of being poor in a valley that noticed, through the Fatix pieces, through the long patience of proving himself who'd already decided, through the savings spent and the fire stood in front of, and the ring carried back from Billings, and what it came to was this: the world had a way of telling people what they were worth, based on what they had. How much land, how much cattle, how much money in the account, and how much fence between you and the next man's property. It had a language for value that was entirely in those terms, and if you were poor, it used that language to tell you something about yourself. And the question, the real question, the one that mattered, was whether you believed it. Elias Crowe had believed it. Some. Not all of it, not consciously, but enough that it had taken him 6 months to ask a woman he loved to marry him, because he couldn't reconcile what he had with what she deserved. Enough that Caleb Rourke's voice in his yard had landed somewhere that wasn't quite anger, not entirely partly recognition, the terrible familiar shape of a thing he'd thought about himself in the dark of his own cabin on the hard nights. What changed him was not a single moment. It was accumulation. It was the way Maribel looked at his fence and saw the fence, not the gap between his assets and hers. It was Rosie calling her mama without ceremony, one of the most complex and human acts he'd ever witnessed done in the simplest possible way. It was Thomas Greer making room for him on a bench at the front of a meeting without being asked. It was Hector Dunn's handshake that held. What changed him was learning that worth wasn't what you had. It was what you did with what you had. It was the quality of your presence in the lives of the people around you, and the honesty with which you showed up, and the question of whether you stayed. He'd stayed. That was the whole of it in the end. He'd stayed, and she'd stayed, and they'd both stood their ground in the ways that mattered. And what was built from that was not perfect. It was daily and difficult, and full of the ordinary friction of two lives merging into one irregular shape. But it was real, and it was theirs. And on a May morning, with roses coming back on the fence, and a child's voice in the barn, and the creek running full through the valley they'd both fought to keep, real was the most valuable thing either of them could imagine owning. Maribel reached out and touched one of the new rose canes. She was careful with its thorns, like she'd said. "Come get breakfast," she said. 5 minutes. You said 5 minutes yesterday, and it was 20. Today I mean it." She looked at him sideways with the slight curl at the corner of her mouth that he'd been cataloging since October, the one that meant she knew he was probably going to be 20 minutes, but was choosing not to make it a fight. 5 minutes, she said, and walked back toward the house. He stayed at the fence a moment longer. The roses were small and green and entirely sure of themselves, putting out their first leaves into the cold May air without asking permission, the way things that had survived long enough to know their own roots tended to do. He heard the back door of the Hayes house open and close. He heard Rosie saying something to Maribel in the kitchen, and Maribel's answer, and Rosie's laugh bright and unguarded, the laugh she'd had since she was small that he'd been trying to protect for 9 years from everything the world used to take it. He didn't need to protect it now the same way. It had company. He looked at the roses one more moment. Then he turned and walked through the gate, the one he didn't bother closing anymore, the one with the latch he'd fixed in that first cold autumn, the one that stood permanently open between two properties that had stopped being separate in any way that mattered and went inside for breakfast. The valley went on around him, doing what valleys do. The creek ran. The cattle moved through the morning grass. The old fence stood between the properties, its wire holding, its posts solid, its gates open in the easy permanent way of something that had decided to stop dividing and start connecting. And the roses kept coming in, thorns and all, because that was what they did when the ground was right and the roots were deep, and someone remembered to cover them before the frost.